Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, the show that's all about translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne, beginning this time with the symbol of an odd organization. Cane of the League. Cane of the League, proof of having become their companion. Inside the grip, a roster on which has been written the names of League members has been hidden. League members lift up this cane to confirm companions. Ultimately, others cannot understand anything like the blood-drenched mission. It is precisely for illusions that oaths are necessary, you see. Now, at the risk of identifying myself as an outsider to the League, I have to admit that I'm not entirely sure what to make of what's going on in the final pair of lines in this description. Some of that uncertainty has actually been removed from the literal version I presented earlier though, so I want to open by laying out everything I see as potentially at work here, starting with the last line because it's the one I find most confusing. Taken on its own, this phrase could be understood as the generic statement, "It is precisely for illusions that oaths are necessary." Remember, Japanese typically doesn't specify between singular and plural nouns, nor does it have articles to differentiate an illusion or an oath from the illusion or the oath. Interpreted in the broadest possible sense, then, we might understand this as an expression of the idea that the level of commitment present in a vow is essential for maintaining any sort of illusion. However, it's also possible to apply the wording in this line specifically to what's going on with the League. Remember, as Valtr told us before, by the oath of the League, those who bear its rune will see vermin. We can even see the matching term chikai for oath in the Japanese version of that line of dialogue. This may also put you in mind of how the League rune goes in the oath rune slot, but it's worth pointing out that there may be a subtle distinction at work here. Recall that in Japanese, it's not the term chikai that's used for those who memorize a particular oath rune. Instead, the word keiyaku, which literally translates to contract, tends to be employed. In fact, if we turn to the League rune itself, we can see that the Japanese phrase for those who have this rune memorized is kono keiyaku ni aru mono, or those who are under this contract. This may be why Valtr speaks of the rune as the symbol of the League in English, and later explains that it's by the oath of the League that those who bear its rune see vermin. In the context of the League staff, then, we could understand that final phrase as a more directed statement that it's precisely for the upholding of some illusion or illusions that the oath of the League is necessary. The question then becomes, what exactly is that illusion or set of illusions? Might that be a reference to vermin? We are told in their description that only members of the League can see them. That would essentially make this a reiteration of the idea that it's precisely in order to see these illusory vermin that the League oath is necessary. The trouble is, that would seem to explicitly identify vermin as illusions, something that's hard to square with the existence of 3 old hunter enemies in the Hunter's Nightmare who drop vermin whether you're part of the League or not. Also, that would go against the allure that comes with the ambiguity that the League hunters might be onto something real, which seems like something you'd expect the text of Bloodborne to encourage. So perhaps it's the illusion of camaraderie or a true mission that's being referred to here instead? Or perhaps the solution is to tie this final line to the preceding one. That could make sense because another aspect of the last line of the description that only sort of comes across in my literal version is that the statement ends in the exclamatory nanoda. This is used to emphasize the content of a sentence, and one common reason for such emphasis is to provide an explanation. So let's turn now to the line that may require the elucidation of this final one. Thankfully, this part of the Japanese description is a considerably more straightforward statement about how outsiders could never understand the League's blood-soaked mission. With that added context, I'm inclined to give the edge to the more generic interpretation of, others will never comprehend the League's mission. It's precisely for illusions that oaths are necessary, you see. That's because I believe the explanatory framing makes it easier to apply the broader statement to the specific case of the League. Essentially, I think we can paraphrase the idea as, others will never understand. The more illusory the goal, the more you need an oath to stay true to it. If I'm right about that, then this at once confirms the active role the oath plays in the League's mission and casts doubt on it. On the one hand, those who join the League will believe its methods and goals to be elusive but true, so they won't mind swearing the oath. On the other hand, outsiders are unable to see vermin and can't comprehend why others would swear to chase shadows, but they fail to realize the role the oath plays in maintaining members' beliefs. This may also be where the official translation is coming from, spelling out how League members don't care that they have to swear an oath to stay true to their illusory goal, because to them it's all real. Meanwhile, the fundamental ambiguity surrounding the central question of the League remains, because it's possible the oath is holding those who swear it to a complete illusion, as opposed to an elusive truth. So that's my best understanding of what's going on with this last set of lines, though as I said at the outset, I do think it's possible that I've missed something here. Thankfully, I feel like I'm on much firmer ground with this next dialogue. How are you doing, Valtr?
Hello, Confederate. Has your stomach not turned at the world of man? So wondrously wretched, and brimming with unsightly vermin, much like our very own mission.
Not the parallel I would have drawn, but okay. In all seriousness though, I find the subtleties at work in this short set of lines fascinating, and I believe the official translation does an amazing job of drawing them out. In particular, I'm impressed by how the translators managed to intuitively convey the emotional experience these lines seem to have been intended to create. To demonstrate this, I want to go through the full dialogue in great detail, paying attention to the effects I believe the Japanese wording was meant to achieve. First of all, Valtr opens with a greeting to us as a fellow member of the League, which is only appropriate since we need to have crushed 2 vermin in order to get this dialogue, but then things take an unexpected turn. He solicits our opinion on whether or not an unspecified subject is terrible. This means the player will either make an assumption as to what he's talking about or be left wanting clarification. Thankfully, Valtr promptly goes on to explain he's talking about the world of man, then makes the seemingly contradictory claims that this world is polluted and also wonderful. To me, this potential paradox gets at the unsettling desire at the heart of the League's mission, because Valtr's reveling in the presence of all that pollution suggests that the real draw here is the euphoria of purification. In other words, it's wonderful that the world is so vile because that means there's a lot of cleanup work to do, work that members of the League relish. Framed that way, his allusion to the presence of vermin in the world of man, and his comparison of the state of the human world with the task of the League take on a disquieting edge. And it's that same combination of emotions, first the disgust at the state of the surrounding world, and then the gleeful anticipation of expunging filth, that the official translation deftly draws forward. You can see it right in the wording of Valtr's first question to the player. By asking if our stomach has turned, this line essentially accomplishes 2 things at once. First, just like the Japanese, it functions as a disarming question with an unclear subject. Players must either make an interpretive leap as to what Valtr is talking about, or sit with their confusion until he provides further context in the next line. This ambiguity in turn heightens the second effect of Valtr's asking whether our stomachs have turned, which is that it immediately puts players in mind of a disgusting experience, while simultaneously setting up the idea that the appropriate response to the world around us is one of physical revulsion. For me, that's the most impressive aspect of this particular translation choice, because emphasizing the disgust which we're supposed to feel towards the world right from the first line is a great way to anticipate the physical and moral satisfaction that comes from the League's mission of doing away with filth. Nor do I believe the official English version fails to deliver on that anticipation. Between the idea of the world being wondrously wretched, the reference to the mission of the League, and Valtr's laughter at the end, we get that same sense of glee concerning the eradication of the unclean as in the Japanese. But that's not all we can get from this translation, because the latter parts of this dialogue provide some great examples of the effect specific word choices can have on the emotional impact in a set of lines. Perhaps the most obvious of these comes from the use of the term vermin in the official translation, as opposed to my more literal bugs. Frankly, I find the statement that the world of man is brimming with bugs to be kind of ridiculous, and that sort of absurdity directly undermines the serious and unsettling statement that Valtr's line is intended to be. Obviously, the line also benefits from using the same word as for the creature the League is invested in hunting to strengthen the parallel between the League's mission and the world, but theoretically that item name could have been bug or bugs as well. For me, this is an example that really highlights how translation isn't an exercise in the cerebral transfer of information, particularly when it comes to translating creative works. You have to pay attention to the effect specific words and phrasings will have on the feel of a scene. Otherwise, you can wind up with situations where the way you've chosen to express something actively works against the experience people were supposed to have. Even when things aren't quite that bad, though, I would argue that a consideration for the intended emotional impact of a given line remains valuable. Which brings me to the other word choice from the central part of this dialogue I find notable. That would be the short phrase, wondrously wretched, as opposed to the more literal, polluted and wonderful. And here I need to bring up something that's actually a potential mismatch in the player experience surrounding this line. You see, there's some debatable significance to the word I've rendered polluted. A Japanese player reading the subtitles while listening to the English language delivery might not be sure which of two terms is being employed. The first option is yogore, a fairly common term for dirt or filth, while the second is kegare, a word for ritual impurity that we've encountered with a more explicit kanji in the past. Crucially though, if you listen to the Japanese voice actor's delivery for this line, you'll hear that he employs the more common reading of yogore.
人の絵は汚れ、そして素晴らしい。
So the question is, how important is it to prioritize the ambiguous experience Japanese players with standard language settings might have? Clearly, the answer the official translators arrived at was that it wasn't worth sacrificing the emotional impact of describing the world as wondrously wretched. For my part, I'm inclined to agree with them, because as we know, the actual Japanese term isn't directly tied to the concept of ritual impurity. Furthermore, since the whole point of the line is for this to serve as a metaphorical example of how the world itself resembles the League's mission, I feel like if players want to tie this thought back to other information about vermin and stagnation, they still can. All things considered then, I really appreciate the way the translators brought forward the emotional impact of both this line and the dialogue as a whole. It shows they were paying attention to the subtleties at work and had the skill to recreate them in a way players could feel, not just understand. Although I do wish I understood this next item a little better. Skull of Laurence. Skull of Laurence, he who is the Healing Church's first-generation head of parish. However, in reality, he was the first cleric beast, and his human skull exists only in the nightmare. That is the past vow he ultimately couldn't keep, and therefore Laurence will likely seek this, though his recollections will most certainly not return. Obviously, as an item directly related to Laurence, this information all has the potential to be extremely important to the lore. The trouble is, it also raises a lot of questions concerning how seriously we can take that information. For a concrete example of this, we need look no further than the first two sentences, which could be understood in very different ways depending on your interpretive decisions. Actually, this is mostly due to the second sentence, since the opening line is a straightforward identification of this item as the Skull of Laurence, first Vicar of the Healing Church. I know in my literal version I've employed somewhat overwrought phrasing in referring to Laurence as he who is the Healing Church's first-generation head of parish, but the opening phrase he who is simply reflects the idea behind taru in Japanese. Meanwhile, I chose head of parish as my literal version of vicar because, as I discussed back in Translationborne 35, I think the in-game context points to that over head of diocese or bishop. In any case, it's the same term that appears in the Vicar Amelia boss fight and the gold pendant description, so the translators are right to maintain consistency. The real issue lies at the start of the second line, because it opens with daga, a word that indicates a reversal, followed by the potentially ambiguous phrase genjitsu niwa. This leaves us with two questions. First, what is the nature of the reversal we see at the start of the line? And second, what exactly is the proper understanding of that potentially ambiguous phrase? In this case, I think it's helpful to begin by addressing that second question first. The term at the heart of the relevant phrase is genjitsu, and it means reality. That term is then being modified by the particle combination niwa, which identifies reality as the literal or metaphorical location involved in the larger sentence and adds emphasis, potentially to set up a contrast. In this regard, the English phrase, in reality, is particularly well suited for conceiving of the ambiguity in question, because you can basically get the same set of interpretive possibilities from it. Are we talking about reality as an explicit location, like in the real world? Or is the phrase being used metaphorically to contrast with the fiction of the preceding line, more like the truth is? As far as I'm aware, either one of these interpretations could be accurate, though obviously they have different implications for how we understand the truth of the preceding line. This brings us back to the question of how to interpret the reversal implied by the use of daga in the Japanese. As I see it, there are two ways we could understand such a reversal to work in the context we are given. Either we can see the second sentence as going back on the idea that this is Laurence's actual skull, since in the real world he became the first cleric beast and this human version only exists in the nightmare, or we can take the second sentence as a full repudiation of the preceding one, since the truth is Laurence was the first cleric beast as opposed to the first Vicar, and his human skull only exists in the nightmare. Having outlined both of those possibilities, though, I'll say that for my part, I'm inclined to give the edge to the first interpretation in both cases. In part, that's a matter of preference, but there are a couple details that I think work out better if we accept that Laurence did have something to do with leading the healing church. One of those details involves something we haven't seen just yet, but the other is something I've already mentioned. Laurence is explicitly and undeniably called the first cleric beast. The Japanese phrase here is seishokusha no kemono. This literally involves the word for a member of the clergy, indicating to me that it's meant to identify a cleric that's transformed into a beast. That's also in line with its appearance as a boss name and in the descriptions for some of the items in Brador's set. So if we're not supposed to understand Laurence as being affiliated with the Healing Church, why is he identified as a cleric beast? I suppose you could argue that in Laurence's case, we're meant to understand him as a beast who plays the role of a cleric, rather than a cleric who transformed into a beast. But that feels like a stretch to me. Wherever you land on these interpretive questions, though, there's one thing these opening lines establish without a doubt. Namely, that Laurence's human skull only exists in the nightmare. But here too, there are a couple lore implications that I think are worth considering. First of all, I've been going with the idea of the nightmare, like the official translation, because it makes sense to me that the nightmare this skull exists in would be the same nightmare where Laurence himself resides, which is the Hunter's Nightmare. However, it is technically possible to understand the Japanese as a reference to nightmare realms in general. I mention that because it gets back to the question of whether we should conceive of several distinct nightmare realms, or a singular nightmare with various layers or realms inside of it. I don't think we can find any answers here, but it is interesting to consider. Meanwhile, the existence of a purely symbolic item unique to the nightmare might call into question the reality of other items we find there. In my mind, this is particularly relevant when considering those vermin drops I discussed earlier. It's always seemed odd to me that the item descriptions all emphasize that only League members see vermin when anyone can find 3 of them in the Hunter's Nightmare. If the nightmare contains a non-existent human skull for Laurence, though, might it also contain vermin without necessarily implying that they're real? Obviously, I can't say for sure, but that seems like it could be a possibility. In any case, as we witness the effect of bringing that symbolic human skull before this cleric beast, I want to take some time to explore one aspect of the official translation that surprises me. The first line in the second portion of the Japanese description has the word chikai, meaning oath or vow, being modified by the term kako, meaning past, which is itself modified by a phrase meaning ultimately couldn't protect. As a result, I'm inclined not to interpret this as 2 separate statements, like the official translation, but as the singular concept of the past vow Laurence couldn't protect. Also relevant here is that in Japanese, the term mamoru, which I've been translating as protect, is the word used in combination with concepts like promise or vow to express that someone has made good on them, much like the word keep in English. So, reading the Japanese for this part of the description immediately makes me think of oaths Laurence might be said not to have kept, such as his straying from the adage of fear the old blood, or his mysterious deal with Gehrman. Meanwhile, because the official translation speaks of that which he failed to protect, it instead puts me in mind of the concept of his humanity. Admittedly, the wording is vague enough to cover other possibilities, including his actual skull, but the ultimate effect of the English wording still seems pretty different to me from that of the Japanese, and I'm not sure why the line was translated that way. Maybe it's another case of updated Japanese text. What we can say with certainty, though, is that the boss we're currently up against is the spirit of Laurence himself. That's made clear by his boss name, where we once again see him identified as the first Vicar. Incidentally, this is the other reason I think it makes sense not to take things metaphorically when the game tells us that Laurence held that role, because the text is extremely straightforward and we have little reason to doubt the veracity of boss names. Of course, even here, I have to stress that this is simply my interpretation. After all, there's the case of Ludwig's name changing from the Accursed to the Holy Blade to consider. There we see a shift in how a boss is identified based on an internal change of character. So it's possible that the boss we're fighting is merely the version of Laurence that can be identified as the first Vicar, already transformed into a cleric beast and missing his skull. For that matter, we could go one step further and interpret Laurence's physical form itself as entirely metaphorical, because this is a manifestation of him in a nightmare, and while we know that he became the first cleric beast, we also know that not every cleric transforms into the exact same beast. That means it's possible that his physical transformation in the real world resulted in his becoming the bloodletting beast, while this version has simply taken on the form of a cleric beast that we're more familiar with. Or maybe none of that's true and the text of the game should be taken much more straightforwardly. Ultimately, as with so many aspects of Laurence's story, you'll have to come to your own conclusions about what you believe is true. Whatever you make of all that, though, I think we can all agree that Laurence's tale ends in torment. And I'm not just saying that because of how he loses his legs in the final phase of this fight. If we combine what we've learned from the description of his human skull with what we've seen demonstrated in this battle, the resulting sense we get of his fate is truly horrific. He's trapped in the hunter's nightmare in the form of a beast forever burning from a fire within, driven to seek the manifestation of his past failures, but doomed to never know clarity, let alone release, should he ever obtain the object of his desires. Also, consider what this fight tells us with some of the non-lore related symbolism we can see at work. Take that fire burning within Laurence, for instance. We know that as an element, it's particularly effective at fighting beasts, so a beast whose blood resembles lava could be understood as constantly at war with its own contradictory inner nature. What's more, Laurence's behavior in this last phase of the fight shows not only his strength of will in persisting despite that fire burning within him and the hardship of losing his legs, but his tenacity in continuing to fight even in the most desperate circumstances, potentially turning the very thing that's destroying him into a weapon to get what he wants. So, fighting Laurence teaches us more about his character, even as it works in combination with information we get from an item description to give us a sense of his final state of torment in the hunter's nightmare, which hopefully we've just brought to an end. Whether or not we eased Laurence's suffering by defeating him, though, I think that whole boss fight stands as another impressive example of how the mechanical and narrative elements of Bloodborne can work together to tell a compelling story. And on that note, I think it's time I brought this episode to a close. As I do so, remember that if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions for me, I'd love to hear them. Your feedback is always appreciated. Alternatively, if you want to hear my thoughts on any of the other subjects I've covered so far, check out the Translationborne Index linked below, which should be up to date within 24 hours. Until next time then, thanks for watching everyone.